place that would shake the foundations of the civilized world.
It is time to open your mind. Time to discover your divine self as we navigate this holographic matrix together. Strap in, cosmic family, as we slide through this wormhole of cosmic information together in search of the truth. The truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's time to go inside the matrix.
Inside the matrix.
With your host, Jimmy Brent.
All right, everybody, welcome to Inside the Matrix. We're so glad that you were able to join us today and going through yet another week of pretty much batshit crazy. So, yeah, it's just unbelievable to me, and it seems like we're now backtracking in a lot of states as far as having our freedoms doled out to us and taken back, and maybe they'll be doled out to us again. I don't know, but it's just crazy and very annoying and upsetting. But before we get started, though, on a good note, I would like to thank those of you who have donated to the show. And I especially a Florida chick, if you're listening, thank you so much. That was really awesome and amazing of you. And we always appreciate that. In times of difficulty, not everybody can help out. And we don't want anybody to donate to the show that isn't in a really good position to do so. But we do appreciate you very much. We appreciate all our listeners. And whether you're listening live or you're listening in the archive, we absolutely appreciate all of you. And we invite you to participate with us, too. If you want to post a question in the chat or give us a call, we're open to all of that. Anyway, my guest today is Matt Presti. Matt is a meta-scientist, musician, philosopher, poet, practitioner of universal law, natural science, and living philosophy. He's an audio and video producer, broadcaster, and host of the series Interviews and the Exploration of Consciousness. He's currently serving as the president of the University of Science and Philosophy, formerly the Walter Russell Foundation, since January 1st, 2016. He's a volunteer firefighter on the Montauk Rural Fire Department in Dent County, Missouri, and the Rockfish Valley Volunteer Fire Department in Nelson County, Virginia. And the goal of the University of Science and Philosophy is the building of character in mankind worldwide, the dissemination of the Russell teachings, and the uplift of civilization through the natural unfoldment of an individual's innate talents and character. Dr. Walter and Lau Russell's teachings give to mankind a scientific and living philosophic understanding of man himself, the mind of man, the soul of man, and his relationship to the universal one, respectfully, the Creator. The unfoldment of the coming sense or new faculty, commonly referred to as cosmic consciousness, stands before mankind in this dawning electric age. It is ours for the asking. The purpose of man is to manifest his destiny. And absolutely true. Matt, welcome to the show. We're so glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's good to join you, too. Appreciate the invite.
And I've listened to some of your podcasts. I've gone back and listened to your music on your YouTube channel, which is great. And also many of the videos that you produced. And I invite everybody to check out Matt's website, mattpresti.com, as well as his YouTube channel under his name. There's two videos you did recently, Death at Freedom's Door, Part 1 and Part 2, that were really excellent and kind of give everybody an overview of what's happening in our world. But before we dive into all of that, if you wouldn't mind, take us back and give us an idea about your background, where you were raised, what your family life was like, just how you got to where you are today, sort of in a nutshell, and you can share as much or as little as you like.
Sure. Well, my childhood was one of intense imagination. I always loved to run alone into the woods in back of the house, and it was just a subdivision more or less, but we still had some wooded and wild areas about that, I would spend much time alone in. So the imagination for me as a child was always a very active one. Um, there came a point when I turned 9 years old that I desired to climb this giant oak tree in my backyard, which was the biggest oak tree in the whole county. And I heard the voice of the creator calling me to come to the top of the oak tree and sing. And it was a voice that would later come to be my best friend. Uh, you can call that the conscience, as Jiminy Cricket would say, back when cartoons didn't suck. Always let your conscience be your guide, right? So the still small voice, as the Russells call it, or some biblical teachers call it the still small voice, the voice within, the voice of reason. It's got a lot of names, but ultimately it's the soul in you, which is the creator to the degree that you know it is. And as Dr. Russell would say, that still small voice is not very active in a lot of people, and so they can lead lives that aren't very fulfilling because they don't listen to that still small voice. But the coursework that I would later discover, I went through my 20s, which was a lot of chasing my hedonist side around, and
as we all did.
I think so. And when you turn 30 and get into your 30s, you if you're fortunate, you'll find a vocation, and mine was conspiracy and music. And so I would write a lot of music that was trying to wake people up, if you will, and it was more the joy of writing it and sharing it that kept me going. And I would eventually, around the mid 30s, develop a love for things spiritual. I was more into the alchemy and the great existential questions of the philosophers: what makes man tick, why is he here, where are we going, and what is man, and those kinds of questions. So I went on a philosophical exploration, and later in my late 30s discovered Walter Russell's work. And I remember reading The Secret of Light, finishing the book, and turning to my beloved Lori and saying, I never need to read another book as long as I live. And it's one of those kinds of books that, you might read some books and get 4 or 5 golden nuggets out of it. Well, there was 4 or 5 on every single page of this book. And it was just like one of those aha moment after aha moments. And I would literally have to set the book down and then pick it back up after thinking about it for quite a while. And being a musician, I think a lot of musicians resonate with Walter Russell, as he was a musician himself. So it's that kind of fabric was already woven there. And it would be 11 years to the day that I began reading The Secret of Light that I would come to open the University of Science and Philosophy headquarters and the official Russell Museum grand opening after 21 years in storage, all his artwork, 64 tons of art and sculpture and personal effects. So it was a full circle thing with a master number at the end, icing on the cake, if you will. And really just a great thing to be able to be a part of that, to bring this great artwork back to the world. And as Dr. Russell himself would say, his art, his 40 tons of art and sculpture was the living half of the message. There's a lot of spiritual messages out there, but the proof that his works is the 40 tons of art and sculpture that he created with only a 4th grade education. Besides a few years in Massachusetts Normal Art School for painting, he had no experience in the fine arts at all, but went on to master them. And that's truly a testimony to the life of a genius. And he said that he lived 5 lives in one. Because of the many things he could do and the many talents he could demonstrate. And he gave full credit to the creator in working knowingly with God as the philosophic way to understand how a man can unfold his own inner genius, a man or woman. And that is really the core of the teachings, is developing a moment-to-moment relationship with the creator, which is dead center of you. And it's not a faraway God or a deadbeat God that owes back human support, who's off gallivanting in some quadrant of the universe. It's a living God that is within, the kingdom of heaven being within, as the Nazarenes spake. So that's really the crux and core of the message, and learning to work with that, which is your own conscience. It could also be said that God is consciousness itself, the field, which is omnipresent.
That we're
and
all
that,
part of.
Yeah, and that we move on that screen of space, which is in and through everything, centering the smallest atom, the DNA spiral, or even the largest galaxy. So it's really a definition of God 2.0, the mother father of creation, as opposed to this father idea. So it's very balanced. And as for myself, I think that was the culmination and the greatest thing that I had ever done of my whole life, which I was prepared for with all the various jobs I had coming up to getting into the University of Science and Philosophy as its president, and then leading the charge to get his artwork out of storage and back on the world stage.
Yeah, I saw that video that you made of the process and going through, and that was a massive undertaking to move all of that stuff to the new location. And where is that located now?
Yeah, it's 518 West Main Street in downtown Waynesboro, Virginia. And that's literally 5 miles from Swannanoa, where everything used to be. Swannanoa was a Medici palace made out of marble, and it was built in 1912 for the Dooley family as a summer home. And it was considered at one time to be the summer White House for the Coolidge administration. But also the Pentagon had looked at it for use, but never did acquire it. So the Russells were able to acquire Swannanoa back in 1948. They signed a 50-year lease, and the artwork and everything was housed there. And in 1998, there were disagreements, so everything went into storage. And that would be where I came in 2015, and then 3.5 years into my tenure at the university, we were able to acquire a physical location and get everything back out. So we're still close to home plate, if you will. People are able to visit the museum and go see the palace because they're literally 5 miles from door to door. So it's really great to have it close to home, if you will.
So what's happened to the palace now? You said it's still open for people to go visit?
It was open until the COVID nonsense hit. So,
Okay.
I mean, now it's closed indefinitely until further notice. That's the owner's prerogative. You know, I have no say over what they do with the palace, but the university no longer has anything to do with the palace other than volunteering to help with the yard work and stuff like that from time to time. Our student body does a lot of the maintenance up there and just voluntarily, but people are able to come to the Russell Museum. We are open and going to stay open as long as we possibly can until we're forced to do otherwise. But, you know, we're just going to keep the teachings going out and give people access to some incredible, inspiring artwork.
And it is a beautiful facility. I saw it in that video, and it's large, and the way you guys laid out all the artwork is really, really nice. And I'm sure it's a wonderful experience to go through there. Let's give people an idea about Walter Russell. Now, I first became aware of him in the early 90s and heard about his books and actually the whistleblower newspaper that I was business manager of at the time. We actually wrote about Walter Russell and his work, and that's kind of how I became aware of him. But looking at some of your videos, I found some very interesting things. One of them was that Walter Russell had these experiences of enlightenment or downloads, whatever you want to call them, every 7 years. So maybe you could just kind of tell us about his life and how his life unfolded in that way and how he learned and that whole process.
Sure. He had what is termed a classical divine illumination. And I should just say that when I climbed that oak tree at 9 years old, I also experienced that, not quite to the degree that he did, no doubt, but it was an experience in the light. And many people have had this experience. It's the least documented and the most uncommon human experience that anybody could ever have. And so when you do have it, and I know that generally people do twice in their life for sure, at birth and at death, So that's definitely something, that if you study near-death experiences, you'll hear many, many accounts of people going into the light, and that it's a light of all-encompassing love, and they really don't want to come back. So it's that kind of experience that could be equated to near-death, but unlike near-death, it's not a traumatic experience for the classical divine illumination. Literally, it's a fusing or a short circuit of the two hemispheres of the brain, which creates a flash of light, and then you enter into that light. And in that light that's the abode of heaven, the kingdom of the Creator. And man is often dictated to. He's told to write down, in many instances, what he experiences while in that state. And there are degrees of that state. There are minor illuminations, which could be, as the Russell said, anything that is an inspiration is a miniature illumination. So if you're having an inspired moment, you're literally having an illumination. It's just a lesser degree. It doesn't necessarily have to be a full-on out-of-body, leave into the light, ascend into the sky, into the light experience necessarily, or even through various color spectrum schema. There's many different kinds of documented illuminations. People like Dante and William Blake and Honoré de Balzac and Joan of Arc, Walt Whitman, Jesus the Christ, and Buddha. We could go on and on, literally naming pretty much, at least I'd say 100 or more. There's many authors who, if you read their poetry, Emily Bronte is one. No Coward Soul Is Mine. You can certainly find remnants of her illumination experience written about. And if you've had one, you'll certainly recognize it. If you've never had one and you've read books about it or read divine and inspiring poetry, and you should have one, go back and reread some of that stuff, and you'll certainly find that there's a golden thread, moving through it. I did a series called Knowing the Creator 101, which is a 4-part series about an hour and 15 minutes long, and it goes into great detail about the divine illumination experience and a lot of the different points and things that one can hone from reading about the experience. So that's a very good supporting video series that'll help to explain that, especially regarding the Russell's work. The Russells, Dr. Russell himself in particular, his first illumination began when he was 7 years old, around the time of his birthday. And he would have a major one every 7 years, which culminated in his super major experience at 49 years old, which he experienced the light for 39 days and nights. And he wrote that, yeah. And he said he had been prepared all his life for that. And that's why he would have the major ones every 7 years, but he would have minor ones in between those 7-year major ones all around his birthday. And his mom said he would basically go into the woods for the week in total elation, and she called it his queer spells. He would, so that's back when queer meant queer, but
right, it meant unusual rather than
right,
what it means
exactly.
today. Yeah.
And so, that connotation, it was something he was prepared for all his life. And, around that time in 1921, when he had it around his birthday, there was also a geomagnetic storm taking place from a coronal mass ejection that knocked out telecommunications lines in New York and New Jersey. And it's a lot of activity on the sun, and it just happened to coincide with his illumination. And I think there were others that experienced it. Paramahansa Yogananda. There were others, H.W. Percival, who wrote Thinking in Destiny. There's just a lot of people who really do understand what illumination is, and it's far from Luciferian. I know a lot of people are going to think, oh, the light, it's evil. But no, that in this case, it is the divine, undivided, still, silent experience of the Creator God, which is consciousness itself, a direct experience of consciousness. So it's literally your conscience becoming conscious of consciousness. And that's how H.W. Percival would put it. But, these are the great writings that, have been around since time immemorial, going back to, Hermeticism and the Emerald Tablets of Thoth and moving all the way through alchemy. Basically, what Walter did was he turned two-dimensional alchemy into three-dimensional alchemy. He brought alchemy up to date with the cube and the sphere as opposed to the square and the circle. And he showed how the cube is the invisible geometry that surrounds all spheres in motion, and that all spheres are doubly charged and have two incoming vortices that wind up to create a compressed condition, which then creates heat, and that heat is given off at the equator to return to cold. And the proof of that is you can look at your own body. You have two lungs, two nostrils, two hemispheres of your own body, and an equator line that divides your body perfectly into mirror image left and right hemispheres. And so when you breathe in through your poles, which are your left and right nostrils, you could breathe in the coldest of air, and then you exhale at your mouth, which is your equator on the center line, heat. And in every way, shape, and form, all planets, planetary bodies, cells, atoms, galaxies, stars, ants, and all life has this double hemisphere, or two hemispheres that, do the same thing. All bodies function in the same way. So he really gave us a seamless cosmology that was holographic, fractal, and optical in its nature, as well as tonal and mathematic. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful story that he called the Divine Iliad, which means the divine story of creation, basically. And that was his 40,000 words that he wrote down over that 39-day period and would put into manuscript form. He would also release his first work called The Universal One to the World of Science in 1926, 7 years after his experience, as he was commanded to do, and give the world of science the discovery of the transuranium elements as well as heavy water.
Now, his work was not all that well received at the time, because you've got these egoic scientists that wanted their information to be at the forefront of everything, right?
Yeah, and they really despised the creator. He put the creator firmly at the center of his science, but he had a very much updated definition of God that he really didn't communicate all that succinctly, even though he tried in the beginning, first chapter 1, creation, divine mind, God, spirit, creation and the order of creation. He tried to define God to science, but he basically said the cardinal error in science was that they shut the creator out of its own creation.
Yeah.
And basically
Kind of odd thing to do.
In layman's words, you're shutting out consciousness, leaving consciousness at the door, so to speak. So there's always that unfortunate side to trying to figure it all out using quantified reductionism, which is only gathered through the senses and weights and measures. Unfortunately, there are many things that are qualities of the mind, like beauty, love, and other things that are not reducible. So, to say that those have no existence whatsoever is unfortunate, because that's, it would be someone like Nikola Tesla, who out of the 1,000 copies of this Universal One that he sent around to 700 prominent scientists and 300 universities, only a few ever got back to him, and one was Nikola Tesla. And
okay, well, hold that
Sure.
thought, Matt. We're coming up on a hard break. We got to take a short pause here. You're listening to Inside the Matrix. We'll be back in just a little bit. Stick around with us. All right, welcome back, everybody, to Inside the Matrix. Today with our special guest, Matt Presti. Before the break, Matt was talking about Nikola Tesla and the correlation between his work and Walter. So, Matt, if you wouldn't mind continuing on with that.
Sure, Jimmy. And we were talking about one of the few people to respond to Walter Russell's work, The Universal One, was Nikola Tesla, who wrote and told him that he should lock his work in a sepulcher for 1,000 years because mankind is not unfolded enough to even begin to understand it.
Oh, wow.
Wow. And that's actually what got me interested in Walter Russell, was that quote that I had found, which was a paraphrase from Leo at the beginning of The Universal One.
Leia was Walter's wife, right?
That's correct.
Yep.
And she was basically his vehicle from New York City to Swannanoa. They had met in 1946, late 46, I believe it was, at a talk that he had gave. And she would go on to become one of his basically biggest cheerleaders, who was able to, with her marketing skills, help get his work out to the world and also save his artwork, which was a lot of it in different places, warehouses, and she was able to help him get it out on display.
Right.
She was literally a godsend and probably the reason we even know who he is today. Nonetheless, Walter's incredible work, which a lot of people consider his magnum opus, I think Atomic Suicide is more along the lines of their most incredible work scientifically. But he would go on to say about science, and the reviews that he got on the Universal One is that science laughed at it, scoffed at it, and threw it in the wastebasket. So he was really let down by the response of science. He would go on, though, to lecture and give lectures on locating the transuranium elements, which other people took credit for. He had actually copyrighted a chart of the elements, a spiral chart, back in 1926. Urium and uridium, I think, and two other elements in the radioactive spectrum. He had named his own names, and other people had taken credit for those and got the Nobel Prizes. He also lectured at a location in California, I think it was UCLA, if I'm correct, to the people who would then go on to discover heavy water. He gave them the location and the wave of elements of where to find it and how to procure it. And he would also write that he was passed over. He wasn't so upset that people took credit for his work, just that they still denied his contribution, basically. They would not have even known where to look for this stuff if it wasn't for him giving his lectures. He also did a spell at Westinghouse in return for helping a couple of chemists with a problem they were having regarding a alloy. And he knew from his divine illumination, he had no special interest in science whatsoever, but because of his divine illumination and his hundreds of charts and drawings, he was given the master keys to chemistry and the elements and the wave of creation, as he called it. And so he was able to present all this in a very scientific way. He thought the reception would be much better, kind of like President Trump probably thought he would have been better received when he first took office. I could imagine, the kind of, blowback that Dr. Russell got just for simply mentioning the creator. But it happens to people. Genius is often persecuted, the most persecuted. And he was definitely persecuted. And he would go on to say that, having a creation without a creator is no more possible than having a painting without a painter, or a sculpture without a sculptor,
Exactly.
or a piece of music without a composer. I mean, everything that is created, even by the world of man, is first a thought in the mind of a man. The step between the mind and creation is the building of a body. And again, I go into that whole process in Knowing the Creator 101, which is a series on YouTube I produced. But that's pretty much sums it up.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of these same things happened to Tesla as well. His work was stolen, and people like Marconi took credit for things he did, and others, definitely took credit for his work. And it seems to be a very common thing. And the establishment, or the evilarchy, as I like to refer to it as, always is very afraid of people that are, have this kind of genius and enlightenment. They like to try and harness them in and use them so that they can, gain some power by using their information or their technology. But they're very hesitant and very much wanting to bury these people in history. And we see that all the time. And it's a very sad thing because these are gifts from God to humanity, as far as I'm concerned. Um, thank God that, the great composers were allowed to come forward, because it would be the same thing as like Beethoven and Bach and Mozart, just being buried and obscured in history. But I don't know. It says a lot about humanity, and we're still, in a very dark place. And I think actually this year we definitely regressed quite a bit by allowing what has happened in our world to happen, not being able to see it for what it is, but just to have an emotional reaction to it without any real foundation. It makes me sad because, I think a lot of us felt like we were progressing in a collective sense somehow, but no, it doesn't seem that way right now.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. And I think the Russells themselves would say that the greatest pollution on Earth is human relations pollution. So we've really never learned how to really communicate with each other in a way that props civilization up and moves it forward with some coherence and some true progression. So unfortunately, I think that the reasons are quite too obvious for most of us when we think of the media and the absolute mind control and manipulation that takes place in our mainstream media, which is owned by 4 corporations, which those are owned by, of course, the warmongers, central bankers, and energy barons, if you will. And
yeah.
So it will be some time, I think, but I always like to think optimistically. I think even though we may be on a slight edge of regression, it's sort of like kneeling before jumping, if you will. Mm-hmm. And always necessity is the mother and father of all invention. And we're doing some really great work at the university in the science area of things, and have been back working some of Dr. Russell's work. And our chief science officer, Darren Colomb, is doing really great there. So hopefully we'll have some announcements to make in the next year or two about that. And, we're just trying to do it in a way that doesn't involve anything but our own process of releasing, because, the patent office is rigged, the government's rigged.
Yes.
Pretty much every energy researcher out there who wants to offer help has ties to people that are more nefarious than, in most cases, than not. So we built all the infrastructure ourselves to do this internally, and we have the moniker of the university as our cover, which is not like a guy in his garage, for instance. Right. So, which is all the more dangerous. But all that said, genius is often, crucified because it's so new and so different that man just can't understand it. So he sees it as monstrous. And in our case, I'd say you did mention Mozart and Beethoven and others who were more than likely funded by a lot of these, royal families, if you will, or elite families. Yep. And even Da Vinci and Michelangelo, wouldn't have had any money if it weren't for the Medici family and others who funded them to let them create art. But I guess the danger between art and technology is just 180 degrees, because on one end, you're looking at who owns the energy companies and the current modes of energy production. Those families would be put out of business by the kind of technology that Dr. Russell and Nikola Tesla, T.S. Murray, and others, Victor Schauberger, would have liked to have put out to the world. But ultimately, what we're trying to do through the university is roll this stuff out through startups and other things that makes an integration period of, say, 25 to 50 years, where this new technology won't just be introduced to put, millions of electricians out of work, or, millions of people who work in coal or gas, or, it should be feasibly rolled out with a practicality that keeps people employed but allows them to transition over a period of time. It's just the practical thing to do. I don't want to see anybody. So we're approaching this from a very level-headed, and that hopefully will make people more comfortable that we're not out to destroy anything or completely put somebody out of business. Because we've got a lot of friends and others who work in these fields, you know, in natural gas and other places. And last thing we want to do is see them affected or their families, their livelihoods affected. But I think we can feasibly, even with the powers that be, who they're not wholly evil. There are good people in different levels of government and corporations that would like to see humanity progress. And so we're going to try to work with those conscious corporations that want to see that happen and do this in such a way that, you know, over a 25 to 50 year period, we could make that transition. And after 50 years, we'll see those giant windmills that destroy the lovely views of the countryside taken down. We'll see all the wires and telephone poles taken down in place of point of use power production. And that means you don't have to plug into your appliance anymore. You just hit the button, the spark creates the ignition, which then creates the interchange between a polarity that is set up by this device. And that's what we aim to do.
That's wonderful. And it's very well thought out, too, because absolutely we don't want to disrupt the economy to the point where, you know, thousands or millions of people are out of work. It has to be very well planned out. We do have a question from the chat from Florida Chick. Welcome back. She says, during an open mind show on another network, she and they were discussing the alternative view that going towards the light at the point of the transition into the afterlife might be disinformation because it guarantees that the unknowing soul will be forcibly recycled into another human incarnation. Instead, there are some ancient teachings that advise going into the dark during transition to break the cycle of human incarnation and rejoin the Creator. Have you ever heard of that kind of a thought pattern? And what do you think about it?
I have. I would say it's in the Gnostic realm. The Nagavati, if I'm correct, the idea that incarnation on this planet is some form of prison, torture in a way. Mm-hmm. And that it's to be escaped, and that when you go into the light, you're actually entering into the light of Saturn, which then spits your soul back out into another physical incarnation. I did a lot of research into that, and it just never sat right with me. My still small voice, just because of my own illuminations, I've had about 11 throughout my life. One lasted 3 days in 2010, but they were all miniature ones compared to, you know, a 39-day illumination. Let's say. But it got me interested in studying it in depthly, and it's one of the least studied, it's the least experienced experience in terms of human experiences. But there's a lot of data that I've been able to put together that satisfied me that, you know, the experience of the light is not one of being spit back out. It's and when you tie in all the near-death experiences, the majority of them talk about the light as being the most incredible love that one could ever experience. And oftentimes people don't want to come back, and the only reason they do is because they hear a loved one crying over their dead body, and suddenly their concern for that loved one brings them back. I also had a near-death experience, and, you know, I didn't want to come back. I said that, you know, please do whatever you got to do.
Don't make me come back.
Don't send me back to that. Yeah, exactly. That was back in 2006. And ultimately that light, which I greatly desired to get into, cast me back and said, you know, your mission isn't done here yet. Right. So the way Russell describes it, and from my own experience and from multiple conversations on the phone with different people over the years who have called the university and said, you know, I've never had anybody who I could talk to that actually understood what I'm about to tell you, and I think you can. So, and I certainly did because of the research I've done. Ultimately, the way that it works, in my estimation, and through many years of research, is that when you're born, you come from an undivided, which is, again, the Russell teachings go greatly into this, especially the home study course. You are unfolded much like a seed in the natural world. In fact, the seed or the egg in the womb is, a seed. So when it's fertilized, it divides in two directions, one toward the body and then the root, which is toward the earth. So we are rooted men, much like trees in the womb. Mm-hmm. And we can line this all up to nature and see it perfectly expressed in nature. And I think that, Gnosticism aside, when you take into the accounts of the great illuminates, they're all telling you the same thing. Lao Tzu and others come to mind. But that the stillness and the silence is the prime actuality. All music, all motion is a division of silence and a division of stillness. If you're standing at attention, you have to divide yourself in order to move forward. So you have to divide in equilibrium. So the equilibrium is not apparent to our senses. There's no way to sense an equilibrium or to sense silence. You cannot sense stillness, but you can know it in your mind. And that's exactly why Russell was upset with science, because they couldn't accept a creator the way he described it, because it was beyond their sensing ability. None of their instruments could detect it. So it wasn't quite, right. Which is basically materialistic externalism. It's a philosophy of materialism. And if we can't measure it with the senses, then it must not exist, which is why they're still searching for a God particle that they'll never find, which is right. actually carbon. But ultimately, Russell would teach the two-way motion universe, which is compression and expansion, generation and radiation, in-breath and out-breath. Our current universal creation story is one of a Big Bang. And how that's even accepted today, I can't even understand, because ultimately it's a one-way heat, death, exhalation only universe theory. Yeah, and it's Catholic in origin. So
it's a leap of faith, my friend.
Exactly.
A very big leap.
Pope Pius said of Georges Lemaitre's Big Bang Theory that it validated the Catholic faith. So there it is. Those who own the world's largest telescope, who they named Lucifer, right, are telling us how the universe began. So I would put very little faith into that explanation. Ultimately, all bodies breathe in and breathe out, including the universe itself as one large entity, if you will, and everything in between. So what is the stillness and what is the silence? What is the prime actuality? Consciousness, what is equilibrium? That is what God is. And that's what Russell's taught in their teachings, was that the creator is the space between the words. It's the silence between the notes. As Beethoven would say, God is in the silence between mm-hmm. the notes. Mm-hmm. And so it's everything that is not in motion, much like you can open your door and see the door jamb does not move, but the door does. So instead of looking for the cause of the door's motion in the door or the handle of the door, look at the jamb. Look at that which does not move, and then you will start to spy out God. And that's how Russell said science could absolutely come to locate the creator, because all poles are still points upon which spherical bodies rotate. And that still point is the creator's abode. It's the white, undivided magnetic light, still magnetic light. And it's basically, if you were to invert space and make it white, and then all bodies in space, galaxies, were to be black. In fact, if you Google inverted galaxies, you could see a God selfie. And I actually came up with that based on Dr. Russell's work. I said, he draws a picture of just blank space and calls it the one white light of God. So if I invert this picture, it'll show the white of space instead of the black. And he said space is black to our senses, but to the illuminate, it's light. It's all white light. And if you think about the movie screen, like Paramahansa Yogananda said, that the movie screen is all white, because if it was any other color, it would not reflect the color spectrum. So the white light of mind is the consciousness field that is omnipresent, and that's what all motions move on. So that is the proverbial heaven. When we pass away, when we refold, as the Russells would say, we enter back into that still point, that undivided stillness, and that is our proverbial heaven. And he goes on to describe it in such a way that it's just beyond anything anybody's ever written that I've ever read. In fact, Leo Russell wrote a book called Why You Cannot Die, which is absolutely superb. It's very practical. Again, it's not begging belief or any kind of, it's called proof in a sense, because the creator being center of you, you're refolding into the center of your own self, not going through any middleman. So that basically nullifies any middle authority from trying to get between you and the creator. It's a direct one-on-one experience. And so as just like you strum a guitar, those strings are going to return to silence. If you roll a ball, eventually that ball is going to come to a stop and return to stillness. Everything does. Exactly. Yeah. And so cause is God and effect is creation, or creator and creation. And in much the same way, heaven is the creator. And when we cease to breathe, cease to move, our soul being a drop in that ocean of the great light of consciousness will return to a state of rest. All motion is trying to find rest. That's what it does. It's an abnormality motion. So all of it seeks to rest, including planets. Even though they live for hundreds of millions of years, they'll eventually return to stillness as much as everything else in existence. And so that gives you just a really incredible, different view of creator and creation and heaven, what it truly is, and why there's no pain in it or no even recollection between your lives. Because in a full state of rest, without any electrical sensation, there's nothing to sense. But you're literally becoming omnipresent for a period of years. And the Russells would go on to say that they basically thought if a man lived 80 years, then he would probably rest in the light for 80 years until his desire became great enough that he would desire to take on another body.
Gotcha. Makes so much sense. It's very, very logical and easy to understand that way. Thank you for sharing that. Anyway, we're going to take up another break here. We're coming up against it. So everybody stick around with us. You're listening to Inside the Matrix with our special guest, Matt Presti. We'll be back in just a little bit. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to Inside the Matrix with our special guest, Matt Presti. And we're having a very interesting conversation today. And if you would like to participate, we would invite that. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat or give us a call. Anyway, let's continue on, Matt.
Yeah. Where in the world were we?
Well, let's jump into current events for a little bit, because we're definitely seeing some serious social engineering, mind control being exerted over the populace of the world, actually, which is we've seen that many times in separate countries. Of course, communist China comes to mind, and the former Soviet Union communist, takeover and all that. And of course, Hitler's Germany, where propaganda was the order of the day as well. Different places like that we've seen throughout history. But now there is this coordinated effort that is worldwide. Using the guise of this, scamdemic that's out there, to really, I think they're sort of measuring us to see, how far they can take it at this point, because the ultimate goal for the psychopaths that run the world, which we all know are out there, is to basically create a slave society of people that will just serve them and their needs, and to cull the herd, as they say, to reduce the population of the world to a more manageable size in their estimation. So it appears that they kind of stepped it up this year, and they decided to roll out this whole scamdemic thing. Um, you know, it's so obvious to see that the numbers have been manipulated. I mean, they've had to go to extreme measures of bribing the hospitals to to get the diagnosis of all these people that they wanted. They've had to, pay them incentives and do all those things, and the testing is very sketchy, and what they're actually testing for isn't even a virus anyway. It's exosomes, and exosomes can be from many, many different things. It's just a natural reaction of the human body. I mean, there's all these things, but most people are still not quite cognizant of uh, the technology that's being utilized against them and why that might be.
Yeah, it's very interesting times we live in. I might just say, I don't necessarily speak on behalf of the university, though historically, yes, and my own interpretations of the Russell's works. But in matters of personal opinion, I'm independent of both fire departments and the university when
Of
it comes to
course.
that.
Sure.
I just have to state that. But ultimately, my view on the whole COVID thing, it's interesting that we're at the 103rd year anniversary of not only the Spanish flu, but also the Bolshevik Revolution, which will hit in October. This entire pandemic, I like to call it, launched in February, March, which is the time you plant seeds in the spring. So using the cycles of the spring, which is growth, new idea, new gardens, things of that nature, sprouting seeds. They basically timed it perfectly with the cycles of nature so that they would water it over the summer.
Right.
They launched just 50 some years after the Cultural Revolution by Mao, which there's interesting parallels if you just research the Cultural Revolution, the 100 Flowers campaign, which was basically allowing people who disagreed with the Communist Chinese Party to voice their concerns. And at the same time, Mao created the anti-rightist campaign, which was against the 100 Flowers folks, which were some 500,000 people. It was basically shutting out the right and pro-capitalists who would like to keep China capitalist for many different reasons. So,
sounds familiar.
yeah, and not only that, we're also at the 101st anniversary of the Communist Party USA. So there's a lot of 100-year anniversaries and a lot of 52 cycles, which is a double 52 is 104. So in the next year, 2020, 2021, I think, there's also the Great Leap Forward, which you could research, which had two waves, interestingly enough, the first wave and the second wave. And we've heard that terminology recently. So
Yep.
2020 is a numerology event. You've got a lot of fours there. July 4th, 244-year anniversary of the Republic. There's just a lot riding on this particular year. And I think it's, from a numerological standpoint, as well as a ritualistic standpoint, the wearing of masks, of course, very satanic in its origins. You can look at the different Rothschild parties where people wear masks, and everything from sex slaves to other things are incorporated into that whole ritual. So what is going to come out in October is the question. Is there going to be, of course, October is, just the month before the election. So is it going to be Bolshevik Revolution 2.0? We do know by research, I'd recommend David Whitehead and Michael Tsarion for a lot of their work on unslaved.com, which is a great podcast as well. Might be supporting in this kind of thing, but somebody might want to look at having on your show, Jimmy. There is a lot of evidence that communism is the preferred modality for the world government because it's one of the most effective at controlling societies. And it uses basically the master-slave dynamic, which the Russells, ironically, and I'm thankful for this, were very hip to communism. Back in a lecture in 1952, Dr. Russell said the biggest criminal in the United States was in the government, or the biggest criminals.
Yeah.
So he was hip, and Leo even had copies of None Dare Call It Treason in her personal library, and they wrote about the dangers of communism and how it was a master-slave dynamic whose ranks were filled with the discontented. And that's really what you're seeing burn down the cities is discontented people. Content people don't act that way. People with characters, Martin Luther King would say, are, it's the content of the character that matters. And that's why our organization is a character building organization. The universities, many of them have become so communist in their nature and in their teaching methods that they're actually teaching hate. These kids don't just come out and do this stuff on their own. They're taught to do this.
Absolutely.
And I think it's happening on a worldwide level. It's been ingesting, it's been incubating for some 50 to 100 years, honestly, in the educational systems, as John Gatto, Taylor Gatto, and Charlotte Thompson Iserby, the deliberate dumbing down of America. You know, they documented how the models of studying Latin and the trivium and the quadrivium were being replaced with this kindergarten like idea of basically Pavlovian conditioning.
Yes.
And so this is really the crux. It's been taught to many generations now, and I think the last big obstacle to a new world order and a global one world government and currency remains the United States of America. It truly is the only place where individual rights are put above the collective, and that for their system just doesn't work. And so obviously we're in their targets, and I would just employ and try to convince everybody who's even got the slightest bit of a patriot backbone in their body to study up on this stuff and get familiar with it. There's a lot of great authors out there who are exposing this. I think it's time to speak. The time for remaining quiet is not now, because there will come a point in the next few years where we won't be able to say anything. So this is the time to put your butt on the line and do what you need to do if you love your country and love this way of life. It's not perfect, of course. We were incorporated, in the maritime law and all that, but that can all be dealt with. What we need to inculcate is the love of liberty, which comes from the love of freedom. Freedom is the seed that gives liberty to the individual. And the individual over the collective is why genius emerged in the 20th century, as it did in the United States of America, because the soil was fertile for the individual to toil in his lab alone without the ridicule of the mobs and the ridicule and the threats of the mob and the collective coming to tear down, these kinds of new inventions. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, because eventually the geniuses would take their creations to the public and they would get torn down anyways, or hidden or back channeled or black boxed.
Confiscated, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So nonetheless, this is the first society really in the world that championed individual rights, which is why so many geniuses appeared around the time they did. Just in contrast, in North Korea, I've only ever heard of one genius, and that's because they escaped to the South to tell about it. So that right there just shows you that, this way of life, it's very precious. And if we don't, do what we need to do, and answer the call when, as Thomas Paine said, I cannot be quiet no matter who calls me a traitor, but now is the time to speak up. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I just think it's a really important time to be alive, and that to also voice your opinions as cogently as you can, especially amongst your detractors, and we all have them in our friend circle and our family circle. Engage them as best you can from a spiritual level, but don't push them too far if they can't handle it, and just try to be the person who takes the higher road at all costs and win the argument at the end of the day, because argument and debate are the foundations of Western civilization. And we're in a very great position now where a lot of people have lost faith in Hollywood, they've lost faith in politics, they've lost faith in institutions. And so there's sort of that window where we have an opportunity to bring a lot of people into the fold and get them to look at things they wouldn't normally look at.
I agree. And I absolutely agree that now is the time to stand up and talk. We are the ones we've been waiting for. That's kind of an old cliche now, but it's absolutely true that I think many of us came into this world with an idea in mind. We were gifted with the ability to see things more clearly out of intent than maybe some other people, but there are a lot more people catching on to what is happening. But the problem that there's still too many people who can be programmed because they're operating in the lower mind. They're operating in the ego. and they have yet to do the introspection and the meditation and the things that it takes to become aware of who you are as a divine being in the world. And until that happens, it's difficult to have the right perspective on things and not to be triggered constantly, through your ego about all these uh, different events that they're putting out there right now. And it's really an interesting play. As we all know, all the world's a stage, another cliche, but absolutely true. And we are in a spiritual school. We are in a spiritual war for the hearts and minds of human beings. And so now is the time for us to stand up and be who we are, be who we know we are, and try and our best to share that with others. There's going to be many that won't listen. They will take their programming because it does contribute to their sense of security, their sense of self and self-esteem is all rolled up into these certain belief systems and certain trust systems. But we've got to find a way to get beyond it. And it's like the old thing I keep saying almost every week: how bad does it have to get before you'll begin to question what's happening? And we're getting close to that. More people are questioning it, and that is encouraging.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Pain is a great teacher.
Yeah.
And, there's many martial arts masters who would, say that holding your center at times like this, especially learning to listen to the still small voice within. Interestingly enough, Nikola Tesla also had flashes of light where he was given instruction on how to build, and he actually drew in the dirt in a park in Serbia in front of his friend his AC motor. So all from a flash of light. We certainly, as Joan of Arc as well, who was 17 years old and a virgin, could not read or write, but she was able to lead generals with 40 years plus experience over her to a victory in various battles against the British. Amazing stories of people, even in the times of war. You could look at Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. He threw his bow down and jumped off his horse and refused to fight because across the field were his brothers and uncles and cousins and friends from childhood, and he couldn't go to war with them. And he had appealed to the Creator, God, please, I can't do this. And God took him behind the scenes, basically, Krishna, and showed him the workings of how there was no death and how everything in motion is basically immortal, that you can't kill the soul of anything. But nonetheless, Prince, get back on your horse and do your duty. That's what your job here is, Prince, is to defend your kingdom against evil. And so much the same way, all of us are in this boat together. Nobody gets out alive. So at least while you're here, make the most of it and do the best you can. And I would just say about ego, I also see things much the same way Walter Russell did. There's two ways to everything. So there's an ego, which is an internal thinking direction, which thinks toward the soul and sees with the inner eyes and listens with the inner ears. Mm-hmm. And then there's your ego, which you could acronym externally generated outlook. So your ego is necessary. I wouldn't, a lot
Absolutely.
of the New Age movement, they say get rid of it, but
no. That's what keeps you alive in this place and keeps you from walking in front of a bus or something.
Exactly. It's how you deal with the external world. Now, there are poisonous and toxic egos out there. Bill Gates, for example, and others. Yeah. Anthony Fauci, who stand to make quite a lot of money off this patented COVID virus, which George they Soros. They also have the vaccines for, which they're heavily invested in. So right now, I understand there's some inside information that I was privy to that they're investigating Fauci for his monetary ties to the vaccine and the patent on the virus. So that could take an interesting turn. Hopefully, many will also bring into astrology the fact that Pluto, which was downgraded from a planet to a something or another insignificant, nonetheless, it was downgraded because Pluto's job basically is to tear back the veil and
Yeah.
expose the hidden
Kick ass.
falsities. So, I mean, there's things in the heavens that are also assisting all of us on this mission, and none of us are alone. As much as we want to think that sometimes, we're all in the parts of the world we're supposed to be in, because there is a need in that part of the world for others around who could benefit from hearing our opinions and our points of view and our well-studied and well-versed research that I think is needed at a time like this. So I would just implore the audience, to always have the faith in themselves, trust in your inner consciousness, which is, the creator in you, and all things are possible where you center yourself and where your mission is true.
Absolutely. Very well said. I completely agree with that. And I think more and more we're getting there. It's frustrating to many of us because we want to see things happen quicker. I know I do. I really can only speak for myself because I'm not typically a real patient person. Although I'm getting better, and having a family, having children or a child will help in that regard quite a bit. But nonetheless, if you can see if you can see the puppeteers and you can see the strings being pulled, it's hard to take when you want to just jump up on the highest rooftop and scream, "Everybody, look! This is what's happening. Look at the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. He's doing all this stuff.
Right.
It's not real. It's just there it's theater for you, for your benefit, for your entertainment pleasure." And it's kind of what happens.
Indeed. It's an interesting dynamic that we're in. You look at the Q movement, for instance, and I was a Q fan for about a month until the third time they said, actually, the handcuffs are coming next week. And next week would come, wait for it. Next week, handcuffs, arrest coming. After the third time, I'm like, all right, this is another externalist savior movement. So
it's kind of like the financial reset, right? It's
yeah,
coming next week. Jasara, Nasara, and those dinars, man, they're going to pay off any day now. And it's been
right.
any day for, well, I don't know, 10, 12 years or so. I don't know. It's crazy. It really is. And there's so much disinformation. So for people who aren't, studied in these areas, it's easier for them to get dragged down into something that doesn't make any sense. But I would say if you're in that sort of state and you really are having trouble making sense of who's right, who's wrong, who's lying and who's not, just keep at it, and let your soul's intent be to find the truth. And my own personal experience in that is, if that's truly your soul's desire, your soul's intent to find the truth, you can't stop it from coming at you. It will just come in droves. And so I think that it behooves us to have that intention, that we want to know the truth. We want to uncover what's really happening. And when you have that intention and you put that out there in the universe, things will just flood your direction.
Absolutely. What the Russells would say is, what you step toward, the universe must step toward you for helping to complete it, to build it. So whatever your desire is, and desire used correctly, the will is, basically the desire to use desire. So when you work knowingly with, building the idea that's in, or the concept that you formed in your mind, whatever you work toward, just like me, for instance, I had an 11-year dream of getting Russell's artwork back out on display. It took 11 years to do that.
Wow.
And I knew it was going to take a long time. I thought it might have even taken more, but it just happened to be 11 years to the day that the museum would open November 1st, and the day I started reading my first Russell book, The Secret of Light.
Wow.
In 2008. So there it is. I mean, the patience, they say patience is the greatest of the virtues for a reason.
Yeah.
So, it's,
I got to work on it some more.
Right. But I think, we have 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day, human thoughts. Which one are you going to hold And which one are you going to build a body for? You know, every show you do, Jimmy, is a body that was first an idea in your mind, you know, your email invitation, and now we're here building the body in real time. So you're going to have this MP3 that's going to be forever available online, hopefully, and you know that's the correct use of mind. And I would say that in times where you feel alone, or you know, it's really great to be alone. That's one of the great benefits of individuality and not being in a collective is the chance to be alone. Use that time, because there's always something to do around your house. There's always something that either needs fixed, you know, go out and weed the garden. There's so many things that we can do around our home. If you can't improve the world, improve your home. At least you have that.
Yeah, and in that silence, great wisdom can come too. Anyway, you've been listening to Inside the Matrix. We've got one more segment coming up, so please stick around with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody, to our final segment of Inside the Matrix today with our special guest, Matt Presti. Now, Matt, something I was thinking about before when you were talking about creation and all of that. It's so obvious that our world had to be created. You know, of course, these idiot scientists and you know, the world controllers want to say, "Oh, it just got a big bang and everything just magically happened over time." And you know, of course, we know that's nonsense. And one way that you can see that is just by observing nature, but also by observing human beings, because everything in our world starts with thought, and then that thought um, becomes manifest in the physical world through action. And you know, it's very obvious that that's the way things come into creation. It's not something that there is an intent behind it. There is a creator, whether it's a person making a cabinet or a piece of furniture, or it's the creator creating a realm or a world for us.
Indeed, as above, so below, as
Mm-hmm.
within, so without.
Yeah.
And, you know, one thing the Russells really gave to the world of man was the process of creation itself. Again, we have, you know, so many thoughts in a day.
Mm-hmm.
We can hold any one of those thoughts. Which one are you going to hold is the question. And when you hold it long enough, you can dissect it, break it down, and that could be your first shovel scoop for building a chicken coop, which I did recently, or you know, your first strum on the guitar for multi-tracking your next masterpiece of music, um, from sculpting to engine work to, and really anything you do, if you always do your best, it's always going to provide you with the most reward. Uh, the way you know that you're working closely with the creator is definitely when you feel inspiration. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of people waste inspiration. They'll go turn the TV on instead of following that inspiration through picking up that pen, writing down what's in their heart and mind, or picking up that guitar and strumming those notes, or picking up that paintbrush,
Yeah.
or even the garden tool, whatever it is. Get out there and create. Use your mind. You know, so much of the smartphone movement and the tablets and the computer age has really dulled man in a way that has taken him away from his creative potential, and you know that potentiality suffers. We're quick to open an app and be mentally stimulated. You know, our senses are stimulated through the app, through the noise, through the game, through the virtual AI reality. But you know, how often do you work with your own two hands anymore? And I'm hoping that, you know, lots of your listeners do, and as well as other shows I've been on. You know, the people that have awakened understand, I think, the process of creation. So,
Sure.
but ultimately, I think, you know, giving yourself a hefty amount of creation with your own two hands is really a way to be involved in the universe in a way that is self-rewarding, because that's the real self-esteem builder, is when you can stand back and admire the bodies that you build and see them stand before you and know that it comes from your own two hands and the hard work of your body that produced it. It's really a great thing, especially like music and art and poetry. You can view it and listen to it, and it's really rewarding. It builds self-esteem, it builds your character, and you know, you're working closely with the creator in you and that still small voice and developing that relationship which is really a centered way to be. And it's the correct application of thought as opposed to just being a consumer. Learn to be a prosumer, right?
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And those of us who are artistically inclined in one way or another know that when you're in that process, it's really timeless. It's I know myself, if I'm working on a piece of music, I could sit in my studio for 8 or 10 hours straight and think it's just only been 2 or 3 hours. And because when you're in that space, it's a whole different concept of time. And things really change. And of course, that the arts, in my opinion, are what human beings do the best. Whether you're an author, or you're a sculptor, or a dancer, or you're a practitioner of the healing arts, or a musician, or whatever it is, whatever art that you are involved with, that's what human beings do best, and that is the expression of the Creator coming out through us. It's all the ugliness in the world, the tension, the antagonism, uh, the artificial programming and propaganda that we see. That's none of that is of the Creator, and of course, without the dark side, there wouldn't be much of a school here. So, but it behooves all of us to kind of be able to see the difference, to be able to recognize it for what it is, and not fall into those traps.
That's so true what you said about time there. When it disappears, you're truly in the now, in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that is all the Creator is. It's as the Russells would define it. The Creator, the one emotion the Creator feels is infinite ecstasy, a continual ecstasy. There's no compassion in the Creator. There's no anger, no. I would argue with the Russells that the Creator does have a sense of humor, because I have seen that work in my life. But honestly, understanding the white light of mind, which all human beings stem from, all seed, all idea in creation itself extends and returns. In fact, it runs on the white light, is the pure energy source. That's why when you create a division in it, it sets up a polarity. That polarity is what we call duality. From the one comes two.
Mm-hmm.
And from the two creates the motions which interchange with each other in a rhythmic, balanced, interchanging fashion. That sets up your three dimensions of width, breadth, and depth, and weight, color. These are the dimensions that Russell taught about, not hidden dimensions based on Einsteinian fourth dimensional time, which was borrowed from Edwin Abbott's Flatlanders book, which is a science fiction. We don't need to go to the fifth dimension, people. We need to deal with our third dimension right here, where we're at. The Russells were also adamant that mankind is the creator of his own evil. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that breaks a lot with the New Age movement. There's these archons, there's this and that. But the Russells put the fault and the responsibility of the creation of evil on mankind himself and his thinking. I used to think the devil lived under my stairs when I was a kid. Everything told me, my senses told me it was real, because I'd run up the stairs so fast out of the basement. I was convinced the devil lived under my stairs. I watched that movie Amityville Horror with my parents, and for 3 years of my life, I was haunted by this idea that the devil and the passage to hell was under my basement steps.
Oh,
And my
wow.
mind literally created it until my dad bought me that BB gun. And then, like Chuck Norris, I went on a mission with a flashlight and I exorcised the devil from my house. I
Yay.
discovered that there was no devil. That was all in my mind. That was my first experience with really understanding that I created this idea of this demon under my steps. But then I
Mm-hmm.
started to notice later in life, with my beliefs and how I went in and out of Christianity and in and out of this and in and out of that, that ultimately the idea of devils and angels are more or less, they're consigned and confined to the world of thought. Now, these people may be thinking they're dealing with interdimensional entities and archons, but I would say, much like the UFO phenomena, a lot of this is a cover for what legitimate blood flowing human beings that can be arrested and jailed are doing in this world. if it bleeds, we can kill it, Jimmy. And that's I will quote Arnold Schwarzenegger for that. But I'm one who believes that justice is physical. And if I did go out at one time trying to find these archons, I had a $150,000 reward for anybody that could bring me one, just so I could kill it and make it take me to the masters of the archon realm, so I could take them all out and end this. I want this to end. And then I realized that, wow, what a perfect cover for the elite to say they're in touch with transdimensional reptilians who can't be arrested, can't be brought to court, can't be tried, can't be, justice served upon. What a perfect cover. Just kind of like they're using all Tesla and Victor Schauberger's UFO inventions for the breakaway civilization, and we don't get to use any of it. In much the same way, any UFO or unidentified object that's probably man-made, they just say, oh, we don't know what that was, and it's a perfect cover story. But ultimately, the Russells, I admire them for the fact that they put the impetus on man, the blame on man for creating his own evil. And that's because he's using his free will incorrectly. And that's what the universe reflects back at him, is the misuse of free will. And that's why the free will argument is so clear and concise. You can study nature long enough, you'll come to the point where you realize there is no evil in nature.
That's true.
So what is the difference between nature, which runs on instinct control, or God control? It does exactly what it's designed to do. The only difference, bingo, the only difference between man and nature is that man's free will, which nature does not have. Nature must do what it's designed to do. Man has the choice whether to do or not. And when he makes a poor choice, evil, sin, guilt, and shame is the end result. And many, many bad choices have been made by humans. That's why I must agree with the Russells. Man is barbaric enough that, to lay blame to anything other than his own foolish ignorance as being the cause of evil is to give him a free pass. I mean, if it was true that demons existed, then every murderer in court could use that as a defense to get off of the murder charge. And what a society we'd have then, right? No responsibility, no accountability. If we're going to get out of this mess, we have to assign blame. We have to start making arrests. We have to exact justice and demand it. And I think that's where we need to be vocalizing. Let's not wait for Q or John F. Kennedy Jr. to come back from the dead. We can start, as your co-producer mentioned, there are class action lawsuits taking place. There are real things in the real world of the real three-dimensional universe that can be done right now to bring about the change that's going to help ensure that our children and grandchildren grow up with a future worth living in.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And even if you said, okay, there's interdimensionals, there's demons, there's reptilians, there's all kinds of archons and Anunnaki. I mean, even if there were all these different beings that we can actually see interacting in our world, if human beings become self-realized and authentic, it would have no effect in our world whatsoever, because once you know who you are, nobody can trick you in that way. Nobody can convince you. If you have a strong moral compass and you know who you are, you're going to stay on that no matter what. And so when somebody comes along and says, you know what, we're going to make you a superstar, you're going to be a billionaire, and you're going to have all this fame and fortune in the world, and you're going to be like, no. And the problem that we face is a lack of consciousness, a lack of awareness, and people that can be bought, people that don't have a moral compass, and they're perfectly happy to just go along to get along and take any opportunistic offer that comes along to advance themselves at the detriment of their fellow humans. And that is a major downfall of human beings. So we have to get beyond that, and of course the dark side has spent, whatever you want to define that as, has spent many decades in programming the school system, our religious systems, our political systems, to keep people in a mindset of total ego and total self-service. And but still, that's not really an excuse. I mean, if your intent is to know things, know yourself, know thyself. It's a super important old cliche. Again, we're saying a lot of them today, or I am anyway. Know thyself is so important because if you truly know yourself, you know that you're a divine being, you're not going to be manipulated.
It's so true. And I would say, too, that the first lie you tell yourself is the beginning of the road to self murder. Because the inauthenticity, as you mentioned, being authentic, there's so many people who think that, oh, one lie isn't going to hurt anything. And there's also the saying, only a fool would tell the truth to a liar. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm actually referring to is the lies we tell ourselves, which
Mm-hmm.
create shadows, and those shadows will eventually come to call. The check will be due. So ultimately, we sort of, I would say, shoot ourselves in our own feet all too often as human beings on the path. But that's where the psychological work of, as Jung would call it, shadow work comes into play. It's integrating those parts of ourselves that we pushed away or tried to hide, or the pains from childhood that we've all endured, different forms of suffering. But nonetheless, we are all divine at the end of the day. And we have to be honest and be true. Go and sin no more. That's really as simple as it can be, which means, don't lie to yourself, because one lie can become another and becomes another. And eventually you've murdered yourself and you don't even have any semblance of who you are, which results in psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
And psychopathy is the leading ego toxicity in the world today. And we're
Oh
seeing it
yeah.
play itself out after thousands of years of building up. We've
Yep.
been through 29 civilizations of mankind, and most of them, all of them, probably fell due to the same reasons, only the circumstances different and the parameters might change, but it's all due to human psychopathy becoming so, wreaking such havoc on the civilization that it ends up destroying itself from within.
Yep.
And we're getting a hell of a good look at the shadow right now, but at least we have the tools, unlike before. We didn't have mass communication on a worldwide basis where everybody could learn that something happened within 10 hours around the
Mm-hmm.
entire earth. That's never happened before. So we do have a communication system, which I think is, and even the Russells would say, that's leading to telepathy. And a lot of people are uh, very insightful. They have forms of clairvoyance that are developing. I mean, humanity is meant to progress. It's not meant to be stale and stay in a barbaric state the rest of its life on this planet. We are going to progress, but that is where the great self work comes into play. As Falconelli would say, there are few in a century that realize that, and he was a master alchemist, that realized that transmuting metals is not the real goal, but rather transmuting the self and unifying the self, the hemispheres of the self, which is what divine illumination truly is. And the closer you can get to getting control of your own thinking and not letting your thinking control you. In other words, to be the person behind what's thinking, to bring
Mm-hmm.
the self forward. And that's really the fulfillment of the alchemical dream. And the goal of the alchemist is to unify the hemispheres, become the godly or goddess of your being, which means hero and heroine together as one. We are all that, doubly charged being minus one chromosome for some of us
Mm-hmm.
that, have the extra appendage, you could say. But, so close we are, yet, so far away from the ultimate goal of that world brotherhood, sisterhood we all seek, which the Russells said would be possible if mankind could get over the human relations pollution. And I think psychopaths, which make up less than 0.00001% of the population, it's basically 10,000 people against 7.8 billion. And shame on us if we let them fool us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we outnumber them so greatly, And I love that meme that we always see going around where there's a long board at the end of a cliff, and the psychopath is got his bully pulpit on the open air side of the cliff, and all the people are standing on the other side of the board holding it up while the
Right.
psychopath tells them what to do, and all they got to do is step off the board. Just get off the board.
Yep.
Or the other one is with all these people, they're holding up the table that all these psychopaths are having their big meeting at. All they have to do is stand up. Just stand up, and it's all over.
Right.
And really, I've said this a zillion times, but it's always worth repeating that non-cooperation is really the ultimate weapon that we have in an enlightened world. If people understand that these psychopaths are trying to manipulate us and they're trying to work us into their world, and we just don't cooperate with it, it's over. There's nothing left to do. If they declare war and the military says no, we're not going, and they tell everybody to wear a mask, and people go no, we're not doing that.
Right.
Then it's over. But that requires quite a leap of consciousness that we're not quite there yet. But I'm very hopeful that we'll get there. One other thing I wanted you to kind of touch on before we go, we only got about 5 minutes or so, is that Walter's explanation of creation in the fulcrum and all of that. How things manifest and that
Sure.
whole.
Well, again, I'd say one could also look up a series I did called the Secret of Light series, and that goes greatly into explaining their science using their own words.
Okay.
Too, I might add. We just made video presentations to help assist people in understanding the science and philosophy. But ultimately, all fulcrums are points of zero, more or less. It's what Walter defined as gravity. Gravity is the fulcrum. It's not an inward pulling force or a pushing force. It's a point of stillness which motion revolves around. So one could take the poles of the Earth, the North and South Pole, and the shaft that connects them is considered to be a gravity shaft. That does not move, but the Earth moves around it. And so that point of the fulcrum is the concentrated point of the Creator's thinking, which causes the Earth to move. And what's beautiful about Russell's philosophy as well is it lines up the planets in much the same way bodies in nature are produced. The mating of two, a mother and father, which are the spiral motions of creation, come together to produce the sun, and suns are the seeds of all planets and all idea. So the planets are literally children of the sun, born out of the sun, as opposed to being cooled by some gases that happen to just come together under the right pressure conditions from a big bang that happened 13.8 billion years ago and is just going to freeze out in what they call the big crunch in another billion or so years. It's just all going to snap of a finger, freeze, and blink out of existence.
Yeah.
Which basically they've consigned the Creator to a death sentence because the one-way motion universe model is defunct, null and void. All bodies breathe in, all bodies breathe out, including the sun, the moon, the planets, stars, galaxies. And so the fulcrum is just the stillness. It's the still point of white magnetic light that centers and bounds all motions. That's the proverbial heaven that man seeks, and it is within him. And all the greats have all said, don't raise your vibration, rather lower it to stillness, and there you will find the kingdom of heaven.
Perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom today. Until next time, everybody, you've been listening to Inside the Matrix. We'll see you next week. Be well, be safe. We'll see you soon.
This is Inside the Matrix, hosted by Jimmy Brent.
Who are we talking about? Jimmy Brent.
Live every Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
It is worldwide.
Broadcasting from an undisclosed location deep within the neon capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. For more information on the host and the show, please visit InsideTheMatrix.org. That's InsideTheMatrix.org. It's time to break the chains of manipulated consciousness and claim our true nature as creative divine beings. Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.